Renfro. She focuses on climate change and energy policy. Kristin received her bachelor's degree from Stanford, her law degree from Duke, and a master's of environmental management from Duke. Before joining Sightline, Kristin worked at the Natural Resources Defense Council, leading its California climate work in San Francisco. She has taught courses on climate change and energy at Stanford Law School and UCLA Law School.
Hi, I'm so glad to be here tonight talking about Oregon tax, and I'm going to talk about a cap too. So, next slide. So we here in Oregon are in this great position. We are in between two world-class carbon pricing programs. California has a cap to our south, and British Columbia has a tax to our north. So if Oregon and Washington both priced carbon in the next few years, we would form this big West Coast block to stop climate change, which would be pretty exciting. Next slide. So both British Columbia and California are good examples for Oregon because their greenhouse gas emissions mix is pretty similar, more similar than it is to the national mix. So you saw from Nancy's slide, nationally, electricity is usually the biggest category of pollution because most states get a lot of their power from coal. In Oregon, we only get a third of our power from coal, still a third, but less than the national average. And our biggest sector where emissions come from is transportation. So that's similar in California, Washington, and British Columbia. All have a similar mix, so we can learn from that. Next slide. So I'm talking about a cap and a tax. I know the topic tonight is tax, but they're really two sides of the same coin of carbon pricing. So as Nancy talked about, with a tax, you're picking the price and then sort of seeing how many reductions you get. And we can use economic modeling to see about how high we need that tax to be, but we won't know exactly for sure what the effect on the economy will be until it happens. With a cap, you're picking the level of pollution. You're saying we are going to get down to this level, and then you're finding out what the price will be. Again, you know sort of within a range, but you won't know exactly what the price is until it actually happens. Okay, so with a cap or a tax, really the two most important questions to ask are how high does it need to be, and then what do we do with the money? And so in Oregon, we actually have an existing target. We have in law that we should get reduce emissions 10% below 1990 levels by 2020 and 75% below 1990 levels by 2050. So we have a target that we're aiming at, so we would want a cap or a tax to get us to that target. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about British Columbia. So to answer the first question, how high is the tax? It started in 2008 at $10 a ton. They raised it $5 a year every year until 2012, when they said, oh, not everybody is following us. There's not a North American tax happening. We're going to cap this for a while until other jurisdictions start to catch up. And then to answer the question of what do they do with the money, so they decided we're going to try and shift taxes rather than just increasing our tax base. We're going to use this to reduce other taxes. So the idea being to tax the bads and not the goods. So we like people to work, we like businesses to create jobs, and right now we tax those things, but we don't want people to pollute, and yet we don't tax pollution. So the idea here was let's tax pollution and reduce taxes on the things that we want, like businesses and jobs. And as you can see, it's actually been more than neutral. The goal was to have it be neutral. You raise $5 billion in carbon taxes, and then you reduce other taxes by $5 billion, but they've reduced them by $5.7 billion. And part of the reason for that is because they expected to keep raising that tax $5 a year, and they stopped. And yet they now have these built-in obligations to reduce other taxes, so they're getting a gap between those two. But the main thing to note about British Columbia is that it's working. So they've reduced their per capita greenhouse gas emissions by 9% over 4 years. And I put up Canada here as a whole to compare, because Canada has also reduced its greenhouse gas emissions. But the important difference is that British Columbia has almost no emissions in the electricity sector. They're almost all hydro, whereas the rest of Canada does have coal. And so Canada has been reducing their emissions by switching from coal to gas as fracking has become more prevalent. British Columbia didn't have that option, so they had to get those reductions in their transportation sector, as you'll see in the next slide. So British Columbia has been cutting its emissions from the transportation sector. And next slide, it hasn't hurt the economy. They're keeping track with the rest of Canada, which does not have this $30 a ton tax. Next slide. And it hasn't increased inflation. Their inflation has also kept pace. So they've reduced pollution without hurting their economy. So now I'm going to talk about California's cap and what we can learn from our neighbors to the south. So first, this is just the timeline. So a difference between a cap and a tax is that a cap has a lot more administration. And it took a long time to write the rules. So they passed the bill in 2006, and then they wrote a plan, and then they had stakeholder feedback, and then they tested to make sure that the market was gaining proof, and finally they held the cap started in 2012, and then transportation fuels will come under the cap in 2015. So it was a long process. The good news is that if Oregon or Washington wanted to do a cap, all of those regulations are already written. We would obviously have to have our own stakeholder process to make sure it was, okay for stakeholders here. But the rules are written, and it was a long, very vetted process to write those rules. And the price in California now is around $13 a ton, so lower than British Columbia. And when the transportation fuels come under the cap in 2015, it will cover 85% of all of the emissions in California, including the emissions that they get from coal power that they use in state but don't generate out of state, or that generate out of state but then they use it in state. Okay, and so but California, part of what they were doing in that many years long process of writing and talking was writing actually 70 different policies. It's not just a cap and trade program. There are 70 different policies for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and the result is that the cap is sort of a backstop to those other policies. So they're going after clean cars and changing their land use policies and going after renewable energy and energy efficiency, and then the cap is sort of the thing that ensures that California gets the reductions that it has committed to get. So it, in the end, only accounts for somewhere between 15 and 20% of the emissions reductions that they expect to get. Next slide. So California's goal for 2020 was pretty similar to Oregon's. Their goal was to get back to 1990 levels by 2020. And the latest emissions data shows that they are, in fact, reducing pollution. And next slide. A recent analysis done by Lawrence Berkeley Labs looked at, well, what if some of those other policies fail? What if they get overturned by the court, or they just don't work, or the industry sort of doesn't actually do what they said they're going to do, and they looked at different scenarios of some policies falling out, and under every scenario that they looked at, California still got to its 2020 goal, partly because it has this cap as a backstop, as a safeguard against other policies failing. Next slide. So similarly in California, California's economy is fine. They've cut pollution 1%, and their GDP has grown 2%. So nothing is getting hurt. And in fact, they are growing jobs. So one of the double dividends that Jenny talked about was that not only do you send the signal to the market, but then you're also shifting your investments into more job-intensive sectors. And clean energy jobs tends to be much more job-intensive. So energy efficiency creates about 5 times as many jobs as coal power. And those jobs are in state, whereas like for Oregon, we get our coal power from out of state, so those aren't Oregon jobs, but energy efficiency, they're always local. Okay, so the next question is, what do they do with the money? So it's a cap, and so what happens is the polluters have to buy their allowances in an auction, and then the state has a fund from that auction revenue, and they have to decide what to do with it. So in California, the industrial sector started out with 90% free allowances. So, and that is going to phase out over time. But the electricity and transportation sectors did not get free allowances. Those are they're being invested in things. So in the electricity sector is being invested in energy efficiency, and for the transportation fund, that'll start in 2015 when those fuels come under the So just the amount of money that they have raised so far in 2 years of auctions is $1.3 million in the electricity sector, and then $833 million in the general auction, where transportation sector polluters are starting to buy in the auction, even though they're not regulated until 2015. They're starting to buy those to prepare for when they have to have them in 2015. Next slide. So California, they passed this bill in 2006, and the oil industry wasn't happy, and they mounted a ballot campaign against the bill in 2010 and spent a lot of money on it. But once you have that kind of a bill in place and people know we are moving into a clean energy economy and this money is getting invested in clean energy jobs, it's harder to tear that down once it's in place. So that ballot initiative was resoundingly defeated, and 2/3 of the voters voted against it. And this is just one of the sort of infographics that was created to help inform people about how beneficial having a price on carbon and all of the other associated policies is. So I just want to say a word on carbon pricing and equity, because both California and British Columbia's programs are slightly regressive. So in general, low-income people spend a greater fraction of their money on energy. And so if you put a price on carbon and that raises the cost of energy, it affects low-income people much more than higher-income people. And so if you don't do something to combat that, it's regressive. So the good news is, as Jenny and Jeff have modeled, and I look forward to seeing their report in December, it doesn't take that much to make those low-income people whole. You can take a fairly small percentage and give it back to them and reverse that regressive trend. Okay, so just a little bit about Oregon. So how high should the price be? High enough, hopefully, to get us to our already enshrined statutory goal of 75% below 1990 levels by 2050. And what should we do with the money? Invest it in making life better. Yes. So just the next slide. So this is just the path that Oregon is looking at. Reducing to 75% below 1990 levels by 2050 is quite dramatic. It's a dramatic drop, and especially when you consider how fast Oregon's population is growing, and that this is not a per capita goal, this is an overall goal, which means that every one of us will need to be living a much, much cleaner energy life by then. And so here's just I ran a sort of back of the envelope calculation of what if Oregon did a combination of policies sort of similar to what California has done. What if we went after clean cars and land use planning and 40% renewable portfolio standard, met all of our new load growth with energy efficiency, how much would be left over for a price to take care of? And it's about a quarter. It ends up. And that's if you do more policies, obviously, it takes care of more, or if you do less policies, you can put more of the burden on the price. And then on my second question of what to do with the money. Here's just sort of the 4 main categories of possibilities of things to do with the money. So my favorite is invest it in energy efficiency that make people's homes and businesses cleaner, more comfortable, as well as cheaper to run. And then public transportation that gives people real viable options for being able to get around without having a personal vehicle. So another option, which is also good, like British Columbia did, is shift taxes so that we're taxing bad things, not good things. And then, another one is just giving it back to people so that you're taxing the polluters and then helping people in Oregon with their finances. So I just want to leave you with a little bit of global context. So I've talked about, us here on the West Coast, but there is a much bigger picture out there. So if you play it, this shows all of the carbon pricing programs in the world. And what you can see is that this is far from a new idea. Scandinavian countries have been doing this since the early 90s. It is far from untested. This is happening all over the world. In fact, by 2016, 1/4 of all greenhouse gas pollution in the world will be priced. So, but this is still far from enough. So Oregon could join this club and march forward against climate. Thank you.